Okay, guys, we want to look at some more public opinion poll information. And I want to show you a couple things here about public opinion with a few graphics. Um, and the first one, this is from a Gallup poll. And one of the things we like to do is ask people the same questions over time to get a sense of how public opinion changes. All right. And one fact about public opinion that you want to be aware of is that generally, public opinion is very slow to change unless there's a drastic event that occurs, right? So we're looking at this particular piece of information here, asking about immigration in the United States and whether it's a good thing or a bad thing for our country. And you notice that if you look at 2001, June 2001 to June 2002, there's a big change. There's basically a 10 percentage point change in the number of people who think immigration is good versus bad in America. And if you haven't figured it out already, what causes that significant change is 9/11. And maybe that's not like maybe that reflects a bad part of us that we're automatically going to see immigration as a bad thing because of that. But remember, when we're measuring public opinion, we're trying to figure out what people as a whole are thinking or feeling. Now, what is significant to note is that the effects of that dramatic event tend to wear off a little bit. You notice that if you look at June 2001 and then you look at 4 years later in June of 2005, it's relatively the same. That public opinion over time generally doesn't change too much or it changes very slowly. Okay. Now, something else I want you to see about this too, look at the specific wording of this question. On the whole, do you think immigration is a good thing or a bad thing for this country today? There's a problem with this particular question, okay? And take a minute, and if you have to, hit pause right now and try to figure it out, right? And the answer that we're looking for here is that this question is a little too broad. Uh, or maybe it's not too broad, but you want to clarify, all right? And the way that we would clarify, like think of this. Would it would it be better to ask what type of immigration? Because if you put the word legal immigration or illegal immigration in there, will it change the results of what people think and feel? And I think the answer is undoubtedly yes. Right? Um, People need to be aware because if you don't specify what it is that you're asking about, you're leaving the people who respond to this poll, you're leaving it up to them to make their own interpretation, and you don't want to do that because people are going to make a wide variety of interpretations. Remember, you want your questions to be as narrow as humanly possible, right? And so public opinion very slow to change, question wording matters, all right? But the one thing I will say about this that in this instance the one good thing is even if it's a broad question about immigration, um, if you ask the same question over time, at least you're going to get some consistency in the polls, right? Now, I want to show you this about how question wording can matter, okay? And they asked people about support for doctor assisted or physician assisted suicide. And you take a look at, they asked the people there in the dark green were asked Form A, where when a person has a disease that cannot be cured, which means they're terminally ill, do you think doctors should be allowed by law to end the patient's life by some painless means if the patient and his or her family request it, right? And you could see that the dark green, you get consistently high support for that. Okay, but change the question around just a little bit. And Form B, when a person has a disease that cannot be cured and is living in severe pain, do you think the doctor should or should not be allowed by law to assist the patient to commit suicide if the patient requests it? And you look at the light green, and the numbers are significantly lower, right? And the key phrase here that changes people's minds is where it says commit suicide, right? Those words evoke a certain imagery, or they cause people to react in a more negative fashion or a not as supportive fashion. Okay, you notice that the first one says if you want to end the patient's life by some painless means, but in our society, suicide is a word that conjures up various images and changes people at a fundamental level. Right? The question wording matters. Also notice too that over time there is a uh, a change in there's not much change in each one. If you see in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was kind of a little bit of a you see the lines crossing a little bit and changing, and that is due to if you've never heard of this guy, there was a guy back in the day who named Jack Kevorkian, and he was a doctor who helped people take their own lives who were terminally ill. And he went to prison for it. He was put in jail for it, and he was a very controversial figure. And so he kind of brought to the forefront the idea behind doctor assistant or physician assistant suicide. Okay, now check this out too. They ask people, one of the things they ask people, what do you think the most important problems facing the country is today? And so they ask him these things, the percentage of people who respond to this. And this one they left more open ended because they wanted people to be able to say this, but they lumped them into categories. And you can see that these stay relatively consistent. But you see right there, look at November 15 to December of 2015. And there's a huge jump and the percentage of people saying terrorism is the greatest problem that's facing the United States today. Now, why did that spike occur? Okay, because you went from 3% to 16% in a month. All right, and uh, ultimately is because there was a terrorist attack. This was when the terrorist attack in France occurred, where gunmen inspired by ISIS attacked people in Paris and opened fire, killing a large number of individuals there. And you see also that these are the people that, like, while there's a significant increase for terrorism as the greatest problem threatening us, there's a big drop in the number of people who say the economy. Uh, that for whatever reason, people start to realize, it takes a terrorist attack for people to realize that, uh, uh, the economy is important, but safety is a little bit more important. You can see there's some consistency too with people who think that guns are a problem. There's a jump there. And there's always a large number of people who think that government is the biggest problem for Americans, which, there's probably some truth to that too. Right? Now, this one shows you how public opinion starts to change over time. You can see post 9/11, people who said terrorism was the biggest or most important problem in the United States. And directly after 9/11, nearly half of Americans say terrorism is the number one problem that America's facing. But you can see over time that drops significantly. And at some points it's like 1%, only 1% of people are saying that. And the reason or the rationale as to why is it's very simple. Um, People ultimately, there's no terrorist attacks in the United States. We do a good job of foiling terrorist attacks. The FBI, CIA start working together. We passed some laws that allowed for widespread surveillance, which you can argue is good or bad. More restrictive rules at airports, and so we stop terrorist attacks from happening. And if it's not there, it's out of people's minds. And so you can see that there's a drop. And once again, the ISIS inspired attacks in 2014 to 2015 put it in the forefront of people's minds. But I think right now, in most people would not look at terrorism as that big a deal. And think about it right now. What do you think would be the biggest problem, most important problem in America if you polled people right now? And to use the term, what is the most salient issue? COVID is high priority right now. Now, I bet there's a lot of people who would say the economy is up there as well. And that doesn't mean that they're right or wrong, but politicians have to look at this data and figure out what policies they should be making or what policies they should be focusing on based on the salience of various issues, right? Check out this one too. Support for legalizing the use of marijuana. Okay. And once again, there's a little bit of a problem with the question here, too. They don't specify what type of marijuana, but by and large, you look at this and there is a bit of a change over time that slowly, gradually over time, people are becoming more supportive of legalizing marijuana. Okay. And part of this is that from 2003, 2004, when most people are saying no, up until 2014, 2015, one of the things is that a lot of the people who grew up with this terrible mindset about marijuana are dying off, right? And even the people who are alive now, the baby boomers who are starting to be the older generation or the oldest generation around, you know, they what we call came of age or were becoming adults around the time of the late 60s and the hippie movement. And a lot of them, whether they want to admit it or not, smoked pot and they realize that, you know, maybe it's not the best thing for you, but it's not going to kill you either. And we also found out over time that the government and other agencies misled Americans about the dangers of marijuana. Okay. And please do not take this as me encouraging marijuana use. It's simply that over time we realized that perhaps marijuana is not quite as deadly as people would have had us believe. All right. But you can see there's a slow change. And now we're at the point where, you know, more and more people are approving of legalization of marijuana. And we've seen that in the last couple of elections where states have been more approving of marijuana, even medicinal marijuana. Right? Take a look at this too, and this shows you sometimes there's a gap, or we can look at subgroups within the population. And you see right here, this is President Obama's job approval rating throughout 2009 all the way through 2014. So it's about a year and a half or a year into his first term, you know, or the start of his first term, all the way through the second part or the second year of his second term. And you can see that uh, 2009, you've got that honeymoon period where the other side's not really critiquing him. Let's see what Obama can do. There's a lot of hope for a new president. His approval rating when he gets in office is very high, 58%, right? 92% among Black Americans. But you can see there's a little dip in both of those over time, right? Where people become disillusioned to an extent. And the longer that a president or any politician's in office, you're going to find out they'll make some decisions that make people angry, right? And you take a look, and even for Black Americans, there's a dip in Obama's approval rating that 92 to start and 84 by 2014. Reality sets in, okay? And it's like, you know, that honeymoon period kind of extends to a marriage too. You love the person you're with, but maybe you get a little annoyed with him from time to time. Also, this notice there's a big gap in between what Black Americans think and what the rest of Americans think. And you know, you can draw a lot of conclusions about what this may mean, but it is significant sometimes to look at subgroups versus the entire population. Okay. Now, this is about healthcare coverage. Now, this one shows an interesting thing here as well, because when you start looking at the data, sometimes the data leads you to ask important questions. Take a look at this, and it says, do you think the federal government has a responsibility in making sure all Americans have healthcare coverage? And in 2006, you get a high water mark, a high point for the people who say, yes, the government has a responsibility to make sure that everybody has healthcare coverage. Okay. And uh, we look at that and you're like, wow, 70% of people think the federal government has a responsibility to make sure everybody has health insurance of some kind. That's pretty interesting. Right. And when President Obama gets in office, you know, that obviously he used that as part of his central part of his campaigning to say that yes, I am looking at the data and I see what Americans are saying. And so Congress says, hey, this new president wants to work on changing healthcare coverage. Let's see what he can do. Now look at the drop from 2006 and even until now, you know, past 2014. What happened to make Americans not support government having responsibility for healthcare coverage? Right? And what happened was the Affordable Care Act. Government did take on responsibility for getting more healthcare coverage to people. And this hurt a lot of Americans. And so they were like, geez, man, every time the government gets involved, they just mess something up. All right. And look, here's what happened with the Affordable Care Act. Remember, there were a lot of provisions that were good provisions. Okay. For example, we expanded Medicaid coverage for people who had low income, and we allowed children to stay on their parents' health insurance longer. There's some good provisions in there. But what happened is you helped out some of the vulnerable people in society, which is a good thing. But the problem was is that health insurance premiums, the costs for middle class citizens, uh, became they increased. Okay, they thought that requiring Americans to get health insurance would increase the competition in the health insurance marketplace, and competition in business would lead to lower prices. And for whatever reasons, that didn't happen. Health insurance got more expensive for middle class people, and so they're like, "Hey, that's great that you helped out vulnerable people in society, but we're hurting now." Okay, and so middle class Americans saw an increase in their health insurance, and they said, "Look, this is a problem for us because you're taking care of low income people and you're taking care of the wealthy people because deep down wealthy people don't really, if you've got a lot of money, then some increased cost for health insurance isn't going to be a big deal to you. You're taking care of old people, senior citizens, and we're glad that you're helping them. But what about us?" And that's why you see a major shift in public opinion. Government got involved. All right. Now, that's why you've seen, at least over the last 5 or 6 years, Republicans have pushed for repealing the Affordable Care Act and coming up with a new insurance plan. All right. So they're just responding to the data and saying, hey, we don't want the government involved. Okay. This one goes back a little bit more. It shows you for George W. Bush's approval ratings. All right. And you see that after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, that's a major event that influences public opinion. And this guy's approval ratings were sky high after 9/11. You look at the Republicans, they love George W. Bush so much that right after 9/11, if you look at the top, I mean, he's over 95, 97% at some point among Republicans. And even among all Americans, you see that in the gray, he's at 85%. That is unheard of in modern American history. Nobody gets an approval rating that high. Okay. And George Bush does handle 9/11 very well, very gracefully, has everybody calm and organized and an immediate response to take on terrorism. But take a look what happens over time to George W. Bush's approval ratings, right? They gradually go down because he makes some mistakes along the way. He gets involved in the Iraq War. There are certain economic problems that result. And you see, he gets bumped in his approval ratings when Saddam Hussein gets captured and when the capital city of Iraq, Baghdad, falls to American forces. So there's some bumps along the way that push him back up, but overall, he's going downward, right? And by the way, that's a trend for most American presidents that when they get in office, there's no place to go but downward, right? Very few presidents have actually finished with a higher approval rating than when they went in. I think the only ones to do that were Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. And Clinton's was just really low to start with. So he was one of the few people that was lucky that he had really no place to go but up. And Obama's at the very end were really good because a lot of people saw Donald Trump coming in and they were like, yeah, maybe Obama's not so bad, right? This is more about the support for the Iraq war over time that you can see they asked Americans, do they support the war in Iraq? And you can see that when the war starts, there's a bump. People are excited. They feel like they're doing the right thing. But over time, people are like, maybe this isn't worth it. Right? Now, I want you to look at this one too. This is a poll asking Americans what they think about who they prefer among Republican candidates for president in the Republican primary in 2016. And you see that they show you what the numbers are currently and the change from the last poll. And you can see from whatever happened in the last poll, Donald Trump, had soared to the top. He and Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio were kind of the front runners. You had Ben Carson there too, and the rest were kind of just all lagging behind. Now, I want you to see though the problem with this particular poll, and if you haven't spotted it yet, take a look at their sample size and their margin of error. 400 Republican primary voters is all they polled. That's not that many. That leads to a margin of error of 5 percentage points. And it's like, I don't really like that broad range for our particular group here. Now, I want to show you another poll. Okay, this one is conducted, and they ask who is the strongest leader. Okay, and what's wrong with that question? Right? How do we know what they mean by strongest leader? I mean, maybe if you're thinking about business terms, maybe you do like Donald Trump a lot more than other people. But when you talk about terms of maybe a political leader or, uh, you know, what do we mean by strong? Like physically strong? Do we mean like mentally strong, emotionally tough? Um, that question's way too broad. All right. And then once again, take a look at the sample size and the margin of error. Right? And before you go all crazy and be like, oh, yeah, it's a Fox News poll. Of course it's all wrong. Notice that Fox News is the one reporting it, but look at the source. It comes from the Washington Post and ABC News. All right. So, Fox News has their problems, but the Washington Post and ABC, they kind of dropped the ball on this one too. That's an extremely low sample size, and that margin of error, it's uncomfortable. Okay. Now, polling data presents us with a lot of information, important information, and we've got to go back on the outline for just a second. So hang tight with me for a moment. Now, when we talk about uh, the uh, the success rate of polls, and we mentioned that yesterday, most polls are genuinely successful to some capacity. Like the one I just showed you about the strongest leader, yeah, it demonstrates that it's way too high of a margin of error. But you could see that even though it had a 6% margin of error, still Donald Trump is clearly the one that people thought was the strongest leader, whatever that meant. Okay. There are some reliable polling institutions, and they'll never ask you on the AP exam like which of these public opinion poll companies is the most reliable or anything like that. But Gallup, GALLUP, is the George Gallup was the guy who started modern public opinion polls and tried to make it more scientific. And the Gallup polls have been kind of the gold standard for a while, but there are other polling institutions that have become very viable. If you're familiar with Nate Silver, he's a statistician who gets involved heavily in polling information and data and statistics on all manner of things, including politics. There are some other polling institutions like Rasmussen, Zogby. A lot of universities with political science departments will conduct public opinion polls. They work together with statistical groups on campus, and people hire them out to do this work, right? Now, a couple of things about polling we want to mention today too. All right, when uh, when there is widespread agreement about a particular issue, it's said to be, or we're said to have consensus on a particular issue. So, for example, today, if we said that 90% of people believe that chocolate is a superior flavor to vanilla, then you could say there's a consensus that chocolate is the preferred flavor of Americans. All right. That's a consensus when there's widespread agreement about something. Right. Now, the opposite of that, when there's a strong division on an issue, we say that there's polarization. Okay. And here's a good polarization information here. Donald Trump, let's ask if we ask people, do you believe Donald Trump is a good president? Okay. There would be polarization over that because there's a strong division. People tend to be one side or the other. There's no consensus on that, right? And look, even though you might think that there should be consensus on that, that doesn't mean that there is. Remember, we're measuring people's thoughts and feelings, not necessarily, something that's objective. Okay. One thing I want to get across to you again is that public opinion polls are generally very reliable. Okay, so don't get caught up in this idea that public opinion polls don't know what they're doing, et cetera, et cetera. All right. Hopefully you found this super useful. Let me know if you guys need anything. I miss seeing you guys. Hopefully we'll be back to school at some point. I'm just not sure when.